Walker Lamond, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Brett.
So
I appreciate having me. It's great.
Yeah, you were actually one of my very first podcast guests back in 2009.
I feel like we're like the OG. You know, we I'm a little embarrassed how long it's been since that first book came out, but no, that was great. That was the early days. We were pioneers, right?
We were in this whole man thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we had you on the podcast back in 2009 to talk about your book, Rules for My Unborn Son. And that was a book, it started out as an online project, as a blog where you kind of wrote these rules for your yet to be born son. And you had your son, his name's Arthur, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And Arthur's 8 now, just crazy.
Can you believe it?
So how has your family changed since then? And how has fathering changed as your kids have gotten older and you've added more to the family?
That's a good question. You know, one of the reasons that I wrote the book to begin with is because I knew that as soon as the kids started coming, it was going to be really hard to stick to all those good intentions, you know? So part of the plan was, let's get this stuff down now because I know that it's going to get crazy. And of course it did, you know? So Arthur came along. A couple years later, we ended up having our daughter. Our family moved overseas. We've been overseas for a while. We now have a third child. Our family's growing. It's crazier by the day. It's awesome. As predicted, things have gotten crazy. You know, you get the mayhem of infants and toddlers, and it gets a little harder to keep your cool and stick to all those parenting rules. But I've had to revise my policy on shorts.
Oh yeah, that was right. One of the rules was no shorts.
Yeah, that's also maybe a factor of living in the desert now. But you know, once you've let your kid go to school in a Batman costume, you pretty much have to learn how to be a little more flexible with them, with yourself. I think like before I had my first son, I was imagining, my kid like wearing a tie and reading a newspaper in kindergarten. And now I'm just psyched if he has on both of his shoes when we leave the house. So, but I still have the book. The book is there on the shelf. It's like this written proof of my good intentions. It's like the Constitution. It's like you pull it down every once in a while when you're completely lost. Wait, I had a good idea in here at one point.
So yeah, you've had to revise some things as the rubber met the road with the rules. Yeah, I remember the no shorts thing we talked about. That was one of the more controversial ones. If you were just like up in arms.
Once you become a dad, you don't have as much free time to go peacocking around in your 3-piece suit.
Right.
But I've tried to stick to my uniform. You try to stick to as best you can, and then you let yourself off the hook when you fall off. But at the time, I really only thought I was going to have to write that one book.
Right, and that would be it.
Because it really was just like a lark. It was a fun little project. It was almost like a journaling project that I had started online. But
and then it picked up steam.
Yeah, it picked up steam.
Turned into something bigger. Yeah, I remember one of the other controversial rules was no wheelie luggage.
No wheelie luggage. You know what? I stuck to it.
You stuck to it. You stuck to that one.
I had 3 kids and still no wheelie luggage. And let me tell you, it's brutal. It's brutal, especially living overseas when we're hauling around 8 Army-sized duffel bags. But I'm sticking to it.
I like how you've got ideals. You're sticking to it.
Yeah.
So rules for my unborn son were rules for your son. So they're kind of geared towards boys, men. Rules for my unborn daughter is about advice from a father to a daughter. But before we get into like specific rules, I'd like to know, what's your overarching goal with your daughter, right? I mean, I think a lot of guys, they think about, being a dad to a son. Like, I want to play catch with him. I want to teach him this cool stuff. I want to help him be like, learn all these skills and be, useful and blah, 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 blah. I don't think they spend too much time thinking about like, what does it mean to be like a father to a daughter? So I'm curious, as you came up with these rules for your daughter, advice for your daughter, what kind of woman do you want her to grow up to be?
Well, it is tricky for a lot of guys to think about this idea of, a father raising a girl because, there's initially that fear of what do I know about being a girl? What right do I have to tell her to do things? But, in an ideal world, and when you think about it in theory, I want my daughter to be a good person. I want her to be independent and intelligent and courteous, brave and adventurous and all those great things, well-read and well-dressed, just the same things I wanted out of my son. I mean, at the heart of it, you want your kid to be happy. I think being happy is rooted in being confident. You know, I want my kids to be confident. And I don't think that's achieved necessarily by telling them they're great all the time. It doesn't mean you say, hey, you're smart, you're fast, you're pretty. You know, I think it's about giving them specific skills, you know, or putting them in a position to learn these skills themselves that fosters a self-confidence. You know, the gag of the book has always been this list of do's and don'ts, these rules, but that, you know, that's always really just been a hook. I mean, it's just a guide to a particular approach to life. And you talk about this a lot on your blog, which is a rich life about embracing challenges and acquiring skills and, you know, rejecting that path of least resistance, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, that could mean, you know, it could mean learning to change a tire. It could mean setting a dinner table. I mean, because, you know, in this day and age, I mean, those things are hard. They're easily outsourced, you know, but I want my daughter, just like I want my son, to learn them, not because she necessarily needs to, but because it will make her happier. I think it'll make her more confident and more interesting. I was reading something on your blog the other day. Am I allowed to still call it a blog? I feel like it's bigger than that.
I still call it a blog. I still call it like, what do I do? I'm a blogger. All right, that's what I do.
Okay, I mean, it's shorthand. You know, you talk about how we live in this land of plenty and kind of in recent years, this idea that we've kind of devalued the goal of growing up, or just in this land of plenty, it feels like men and women both have this temptation to not do as much. But I want my daughter to do more. You know, I want her to travel and cook and eat and read and vote and build stuff. And, you know, it's not necessarily out of a need for survival anymore, but it is about this need to have a rich life. So, I mean, my goals for my daughter are the same as for my son. You know, resist the path of least resistance.
I'm curious, has your approach to fathering changed because you have a daughter? So I've talked to a lot of guys that said that it did. Like the way they approach fatherhood changed when they had a daughter compared to when they had a son. Or for you, is it pretty much the same?
You know, before you have kids, and when you think about having a son, you know, most guys, they kind of envision their son as going to be like this new and improved version of themselves.
Right.
You know, like,
yeah,
I'm going to teach you everything I know, and I'm going to correct all my own mistakes.
Right.
You know?
The thing I remember was like, yeah, my kids are going to just play with wooden blocks. They're not going to watch TV. They're going to use their imaginations.
Yeah. Every hobby that I always meant to pick up, like I'm going to like teach them immediately. And that's cool. That's what being a dad's all about. And then you have your kid and you realize that they're totally their own person. And I mean, they can be so different from you. They're like strangers sometimes. I mean, you know, my son is my flesh and blood, but he could be a guy I just ran into in a bar. We're so different sometimes. So, you know, it's not just now about like making him a version of yourself. When you have a daughter, it only amplifies that feeling. She has these unique challenges that we can't even begin to understand. You know, so I think having that daughter, it does teach you to take it a little easier on yourself and your expectations about kind of, you know, being a parent, what you're going to teach these people. I mean, because, you know, when you're parenting, it's a lot of it's about projecting your own need for self-improvement on them. But having a daughter it's wonderful, you know. I mean, having a daughter is like the best way to turn any man into a feminist, you know. But you know, does my approach to parenting change a little bit? It's a good question because, you know, I really stick to this idea that I've always thought all the advice I put, even in the first book, you know, is all pretty gender neutral. You know, I mean. yes, the first book was a conversation between a father and a son, and there's a lot of, guy imagery, and there's a lot of, it was pretty male centric, or at least if not in tone, whatever. But I always kind of thought like, girls, this is for girls too. But then my wife kind of pointed out, she's like, yeah, but then there's this stuff about neckties and baseball, and maybe girls need their own book. And I started thinking about that. I was like, is that a good thing that girls need their own book, that they should have their own rules, or should I, dismiss that as perpetrating some gender divide that doesn't exist? I mean, these are all questions you can kind of debate forever, but in reality, girls and boys are different. You realize that as soon as they're born. They're wonderfully different. They're hilariously different, but not just because they're boys and girls, because they're different people. My daughter is just very different from my son. So, are the things I'm teaching my daughter any different than the ones I'm teaching my son? No. I mean, when we go outside and practice putting up the tent in the backyard, she's there too, hammering in stakes. If we're planting veggies in the garden, they're both there. These aren't girl and boy skills. Learning to sail or play the piano, and my daughter's super competitive, so she wants to be right there with my son. I don't think any of these skills are necessary. I don't think any of these things are gender specific. I'm strongly feel that. Setting a table or writing thank you notes or wrenching a car, every boy and girl should know how to do this. But, that is not to say that they are the same, that boys and girls are the same or will or ever, that they'll have the same skill set. They're going to have different skills because they have different interests. My son's going to be into camping, my daughter's into sports. So you do have to adapt a little bit for each kid, not because they're a boy and a girl, but because they're different people.
Right.
Does that make any sense?
That makes perfect sense. No, that makes perfect sense. It's the same with my kids. My daughter, she likes to do the stuff that me and Gus do. She's right there with us, rough and tumble, roughhousing, going outside, doing monkeying around in my garage gym. She's right there. And that
could change.
Yeah, that could change.
These kids are going to hit puberty, and they're going to have all kinds of different things going on their mind and bodies, and their interests might change, and I might have to adapt what skill sets I'm teaching them, and outsource some of that stuff to their mom or whatever. But I'll let you keep going, because it is a tricky issue, and we'll get to it, I think.
Yeah. Well, and then speaking of, so a lot of the advice, like you said, and the rules for my unborn daughter, I was reading is this is a nice reminder for me, right? Yeah, I should write thank you notes, or I shouldn't apologize for other people all the time, right? That's just good common, how to live a good life. But there is advice in there that's geared towards girls or women in general. So I'm curious, as a dude, as a guy, how did you approach some of the more gendered advice that's, maybe applicable just to girls? Did you have to get your wife in on to help you? And what do I tell my daughter? What are we going to tell our daughter about these sorts of things?
Yes, of course. And my wife has been a great resource. And look, I was raised by women. My life, I've been surrounded by all these wonderful, creative, smart, intelligent women. And, so I do feel like I have this body of institutional knowledge that I kind of am allowed to pass down to my daughter. But so it goes back to this kind of main problem I had. One of the reasons I didn't do this book immediately is because I did have this nagging question of whether or not, as a man, I had a right. Was it even appropriate for me to be doling out advice to a woman?
Mansplaining. You don't want to mansplain.
Yeah, right? And that's this become this buzzword. And I hesitated a long time about doing it. And then, if I want my daughter to be this strong, independent, brave woman who's unafraid to challenge power structures and gender stereotypes, and then the first thing I do is hand her this book of rules written by a white 40-year-old man. It doesn't sound like the best way to start out this journey, right? But, I do think that daughters want to hear from their dads. We have institutional knowledge as an older person. And they don't just want necessarily our approval or a nice well done or whatever. They want ideas. They want advice like any kid does. Boys and girls are so thirsty for this institutional knowledge. So I think as dads, we can confidently say that we do have a right and we have a duty to tell our daughters what we expect of them. I don't think we should be ashamed to do that or nervous to do that. I think we're allowed to share with them what we know about life and how to make the best of it. That said, I had a system of checks and balances, my wife being the best one of all. My wife is a trained aerospace engineer. She's a Foreign Service officer. She's works harder than anyone I know. She's graceful. She's funny. She's like the archetype, she's the role model. And if I could have gotten her to write this book, I would have, but she's too busy earning a living for the family. So, but she had the veto power, she was my checks and balances. The reality is, and you know this, Brett, and I know that because I know that you deal with a lot of these issues on your blog all the time. The gender identities and traditional power structures and stuff. But I really believe that if you've lived a life in which you've respected women and you've kept their company and you've admired their talents, then even as a man, you are qualified to pass on some of that institutional knowledge, even down to a girl. Right. There's plenty of stuff I've learned from my mom and my grandmother and my sister and my own role models, many of which are women, that I want to pay forward. Yes, it will come through the filter of a man, and whatever kind of historical baggage I carry with me, maybe not without even knowing it, but it's also just coming through the lens of being an older person or being an American or whatever. You can't kind of avoid that lens. But, I'm not trying to maintain the male power structure or male privilege. I'm not, by giving my daughter a book of rules. I mean, I have no interest as a father in making things harder for my own daughter to put her at a disadvantage. I want to break down the walls for her, or better yet, just get out of the way and let her do it for herself. Give her the skills so she can do it. Mansplaining perhaps, but
I think it's just a dad giving advice to your daughter.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is. And I think it comes from the best of intentions and you're trying to do what's best for her. But I mean, the other kind of, some people would say problematic, quotation marks, aspect of Rules for My Unborn Son and Rules for My Unborn Daughter. And I even get this with The Art of Manliness. It's got like the whole vintage retro vibe to it. And kind of hearkening back to this, traditional stereotypes of masculinity. And you do that with your book. And I love with both of them books. But I love it. I mean, it looks great. You have these great vintage photos of, starlets and famous women, Margaret Thatcher and Eleanor Roosevelt and I guess Graham, who owned the newspaper, the Washington Post.
Yeah.
And it's got this old-fashioned feel to it, but it's not stodgy. So you've been able to somehow combine, some traditional gender advice for gals on, being a classy lady, a dame,
being a classy broad,
classy broad, but with advice on being independent and assertive and brave. That bucks antiquated gender stereotypes. And I'm sure this has to drive people bonkers. Cause they either want it okay, no, you got to either do it, the traditional thing all the way, or you have to go this way. So
it's look, I know you've dealt with this because like you said, the whole vintage aesthetic of your site, of my book, it was very au courant at the time, 7 years ago or whatever. But people just kind of assume that we're just going to be blindly nostalgic about the past.
Exactly.
And, with my first book, there was, of course, that knee-jerk reaction from boys and girls, men and women, So some of the bros out there just assumed that this was, a book just praising everything about what was old-fashioned and, that means the good old days when we can assert our male privilege and all that stuff. And there were plenty of women that looked at my blog or looked at my book, saw maybe the title, saw one rule, and just bristled at the idea that there were going to be any rules or skills that only pertained to boys. It felt really exclusive. And, I think with the last book and with this one, I think if you just read it, hopefully just see that, most of all, these rules most of them can be applied to boys and girls or gay or straight or whatever, but mostly, look, it's harmless fun mostly, but I know that there's, the outrage police will probably jump on this one just like they did the last one. Oh, this is a man telling a woman what to do. But if you read it, it's pretty harmless. Hopefully it's a little funny. I think it's practical at times, but it's important to remember not to get carried away. I mean, this is a very little book. It's just a trifle, really. It's not a manifesto. These rules are about developing skills and becoming self-reliant, and that includes not taking shit from your brother or any other person. So, I know empowerment is a bit of a buzzword these days, but I would characterize a lot of the rules in this book as empowering.
Right.
And
I think go ahead.
I was just going to say, some of the skills, some of the stuff in there is going to sound old-fashioned, and because of that, just like on your blog, I think there are so many skills that are being lost that just so many skills just sound old-fashioned. And so because of that, for the boys' book, it was fine. Everything about old-fashioned was good because it kind of played into the male need to go back to those good old days or whatever. For a book for girls, it's different because old-fashioned is tainted with this memory of an era of male privilege or when women had less opportunities, and so it is tricky. But that doesn't mean that these skills are necessarily invalid. If I teach my daughter to cook a pie, I'm not telling her, you must cook pies.
Get in the kitchen and cook a pie.
Yeah, I'm just giving her a skill, and that gives her the choice to cook a pie or not to cook a pie. If I teach her to set a proper dinner table or hem a dress, I'm not saying that she has to play, suburban hostess her whole life or even wear a dress. No more than if if I teach my son to change a tire, I'm telling him he has to be a mechanic. The skills give you choice, and choice is power, so I think the big takeaway is that I don't think that there are gender-specific skills.
Right. But even when you talk about gender differences, because you talk about, the etiquette, right? If one of the advices, if a man offers you his seat, take it. And now some women would bristle at that. But I think what you're doing is, and I think we try to do this too, is it's like appreciating differences between men and women. And just having fun with it and celebrating those differences and not seeing these sort of gestures as acts of subjugation or submission or whatever, but just sort of hey, we're men and women, we're different. We got these sort of rituals to talk about that, and let's celebrate that.
And rituals is a good word, and rituals and customs, and sometimes you can't look at rituals and customs so literally. They become kind of symbolic gestures of what you just said. Recognizing our differences and celebrating those. As far as the idea of being a lady, and it's a little like the idea of a gentleman. These words are so saddled with baggage about chivalry and or for a lady maybe female submission, but it's not. I mean, this is about being a kind, intelligent person, and those, some may say, antiquated gestures of a gentleman or a lady, they can kind of represent whatever you want them to represent. If you're going into it as a cynic, they may represent a bad days or whatever. But you can also look at it as this is a symbol or a custom that represents my effort to be kind, generous, well-mannered. It's tricky. I'm kind of what I'm doing, I think, with you is I'm building up my argument for the inevitable onslaught of online hate, which I've already gotten, which is fine. I mean, it's great. It gives me a chance to think about this stuff. Honestly, when I wrote the first book, I never even gave a thought to, being very overtly inclusive to kind of non-binary sexualities and things. And at first, I kind of felt myself backpedaling about worrying about, oh man, was I sounding too heteronormative and all that stuff? But it was good. It got me thinking about, well, wait a second, these skills work if my kid's gay or not. I don't care, So this is a good conversation to have, and I'm fine having it,
Right. So let's kind of get some more of the rules. What I thought was interesting, there's a lot of relationship advice in there, and I thought that was great because I think like dads like need to talk to their daughters about relationships because like dads are men and their daughters will be encountering men. So I'm curious, like, how has being a man colored the dating advice or relationship advice that you've put in the book?
Well, I mean, you have to fight your instinct to make every rule in the book basically like, don't go out with him. Don't
right,
go out
exactly. That's kind of the thing I was getting is the vibe was like, I think like Walker had his shotgun out, cleaning it.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
it's funny. It's like, a dad giving relationship advice to his daughter. It has its challenges. I mean, your instinct is to go into protective mode with all your kids, but with your daughter, I don't know, maybe it's evolution or whatever, but you want to just talk about, you can't date that guy and they're all after one thing. Trust me, I've been there. I'm a teenager, but I do think it's important, and it was important for me to get past that. And it took some help from some very smart female friends of mine to point out that it's time to get past that. It's not really that charming anymore to play,
overprotective dad.
Top up there.
Right.
Yeah. Because, I'm all for protecting my kid's safety. I mean, it's not an issue of that. It's about, if parenting is about giving your kid the skills and tools to make their own smart decisions, then you kind of have to do it and then trust what you've taught them. And to be too protective it's a little weird. It's a little like over-sexualizing your own kid. And so you don't want to muck around too much in her love life, saying, I don't trust you, and all that stuff. But, so you give them these tools and you give them these rules, right? And you hope for the best.
Right.
That doesn't mean I might, come to the door with a fierce look in my eye one day, or if the kid doesn't come to the door and knock on ring the doorbell or he honks his car, I can, hope that she makes the right choice. But look, my daughter's going to be a kick-ass, like intelligent, fun-loving woman, confident, great taste. She's not going to need my help to like fend off the barbarians at the gate. She's going to do it herself. Right. That's the point.
So I mean, like, I thought one of the pieces of relationship advice was funny. It made me chuckle and actually kind of like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But like, it was beware of men who cry easily. So why should your daughter watch out for men who cry? What is it about men who cry easily that your daughter should be like, I don't know about that?
Well, I should make this clear, is that I'm a crier. I mean, I'm a crier. I'm the guy getting misty watching like Folgers commercials. And so way more times than I want to admit, I've blubbered in front of my wife, in front of a bartender. I'm not proud of it. So
that's right. Well, Winston Churchill was a crier, so you're in good company.
This is one of those rules where it's like, you're hoping to correct past mistakes. But look, there's nothing wrong with having a good cry. But what I think what I mean by this rule is that, be wary of people who, or men in particular, who may think that showing this type of outward emotion, like volunteering it really easily, is somehow a demonstration of depth or sensitivity or intelligence.
Yeah.
And I think, because I've been there, again, if I'm going to give this advice to my daughter, in my experience, it's a tactic as much as anything else, and not a very handsome one. And also, I will point out that this rule came from my wife. So it shows you what she thinks about me, obviously, since I'm the crier.
Right.
But I showed it to her, and she agreed wholeheartedly. So.
All right. Yeah. So I agree with you. I think like a lot of people who cry all the time at a drop of the head. Yeah, it is a tactic.
It is, or at least it's kind of like, I don't know. It strikes me as a little. It can strike me as a little weird. You just have to be a little wary. But also remember that so many of these rules can be a little tongue in cheek.
Right, exactly. I think, yeah, like we learned with rules for My Unborn Son, sometimes people will take these things way too serious.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I posted one the other day, and sometimes I really post things like they're quite literal. I'm not going to give you the example right now because it inflared like this huge conversation online, but sometimes I mean them quite literally, and then some people will read them like there's some proverb, like, and which is really flattering, but I'm also like, no, I actually mean, roll the dough really flat or whatever. Don't squeeze out the juices on the burger. I'm just like, no, that's very literal advice. You're like, so.
Yeah, no, I think that was like Hemingway had a problem with that. Like people like read too much into The Old Man in the Sea, and he's like, no, it's just what was he hunting, like a shark or a fish? It was just a fish.
Yeah. I just mean the bottle is green. I really
do. So let's talk about some of my favorite quips from the book. And
yeah, good. I love hearing about it because it's hard to pick your own favorites.
Right. So like one I liked, I said earlier, like if you make it a habit for apologizing for other people, it will always it's you who will always be sorry.
Yes. I mean, it's going to drive you crazy your whole life too, right? We have, I don't know if it's just like, I can only speak for the people alive today, right? I don't know what it was like 100 years ago, but it does seem like we enable so many people's bad behavior because we're just afraid of confrontation, where we don't think it's our place to change another person, especially people that are close to us, to tell them that they're wrong or tell them that they're acting poorly. You're acting boorishly or whatever. So we end up apologizing for our friends or our spouses. But we all have our own problems and struggles. You don't want to carry the burden of someone else's too, Right. You gotta let, and obviously this is kind of like a universal advice, but it can be a very specific advice for a woman too in a relationship, because we know that a very common problem is, women that have to tolerate less than savory characters in their life, and they're working hard to keep a relationship together and end up apologizing for someone when really you might just need to pick up and haul ass.
Right, exactly. Another one in there: beware the ladies who lunch.
That is a hat tip to one of my favorite women in the world, Elaine Stretch, a great Broadway and film actress who you may know. You probably recognize her because she did some cameos on 40 Rock late in her life. But this was her signature song. It comes from Stephen Sondheim's play Company. And she's really one of my idols. Back when I was living in New York, I had the chance to work with her because I was working on a documentary about her with D.A. Pennebaker. And so I got to meet her. And she's this tough old bird, and she's hysterical and ruthless. But she's also really sensitive, and she's so talented. And anyway, this was her signature song, and it's so scathing. And it's all about women who make this big fuss about their lives with like the charity events and the lunches and the brunches and the martini tennis lessons. And, and they're always busy. And, there's nothing wrong with any of those things. There's nothing wrong with these women, but, it's about, for this song, it's about women who fill their lives to make up for some kind of deeper emptiness. You can be busy and still bored and boring.
Right.
And it's very tricky to avoid that group. But again, a bit tongue in cheek, but one of my favorite songs, by the way. If any of you gentlemen out there close to Spotify and want to download some Broadway show tunes, which I know you're all eager to do.
Oh yeah.
The Ladies Who Lunch from Company is a great one. It's so funny.
I'll check that out.
All right.
You got another one here. If you choose not to own a TV, keep it to yourself.
God, don't you just hate it when people say that? I don't even own a TV.
Yeah, I know.
So, it's
they talk about I get so much more done. Blah blah blah.
I mean, it's a humble brag, right? It's so much more charming and interesting to embrace your guilty pleasures. Be self-deprecating. Like in that situation, I'd be like, oh, I have a TV and I'm obsessed with it. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I stay up till 4 a.m. to binge watch this particular show or whatever, I mean, this is one of those rules where yes, it's about TV, but it is about something a little bigger. I mean, we need to remember that, cocktail parties are not job interviews. a conversation with someone is not just you nodding your head and waiting for your turn to talk about yourself or your story. Your job is not to constantly pitch yourself. And I think it's a habit that's really common these days. And I don't know if it's because, more people are out there self-employed or trying to be an entrepreneur but there's this, we've really kind of glorified the pitch, whether it's Silicon Valley or Hollywood. It's like everyone's pitching something or themselves. And it makes for like the most boring cocktail conversation in the world when everyone is just talking about themselves. This is how great I am. Right. And they might couch it by saying like, oh, I'm so tired and busy. Yeah, because, I'm finishing this article from the New Yorker or, it's like these humble brags. And I think not owning TV is one of them. Right. It's like, I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on in Breaking Bad. I only read the New York Times article. It's like, well, good for you. Good. I'm going to go talk to someone who watched The Last Kardashian because then we can have a laugh.
Right. Right. And it's the same thing with not only that, like if you're into paleo, if you do CrossFit or you do yoga.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a million examples.
Examples. Just like keep it to yourself. Unless
it
comes up.
Is that a GMO chicken nugget? Right. Whatever.
Okay, whatever. So this is the one I thought was like, you don't drink wine at the ballpark. First, is this a thing? Do people drink wine at the ballpark?
Have you been to one of the new fancy parks like Nationals Park or,
No,
they've been redoing a lot of parks? I mean, look, some people might think it's great. I can get a crab cake sandwich at Nationals Park and a white wine, and you can probably ask them to roll a lazy boy in there too for you, and maybe even put a TV in your pocket. Most people are watching the game on their iPhones anyway. I don't really care what you drink or if you drink, but there's something about working. I just think there's something about working within the confines of your environment, right? Not always changing the environment to suit you. I mean, I've gone camping. We were talking about Boy Scouts earlier. I've gone camping with Boy Scouts, and some of these dads, every year, they're bringing out like these bigger and bigger grills, and to the camp out. And I'm like, all right, that's cool. But I also I like enjoying the simplicity and the restrictions of like a hot dog and a hobo pack over an open fire. I mean, yeah, you can have an awesome, tailgate set up and eat ribeyes. That's cool. But, you can also have a lazy boy and buffalo wings at the movie theater now and all this stuff. But I don't need wine at the ballpark. I don't need to bring my home to wherever I am. Right. Sometimes it's good to restrict yourself to what's available. Just ballparks should serve Cracker Jacks and hot dogs. That's it.
Right.
You want a crab cake sandwich, go to the restaurant across the street.
Right. No, that's I didn't know that was a thing. That's interesting. So the other one I liked is it's you're welcome, not no problem. I love that because my father-in-law, he hates that. Like he hates when people tell him no problem when they do something. It
drives me crazy. It drives my wife crazy. It's one of my peccadillos. When you say no problem, it kind of assumes that maybe it could have been a problem, but I'm letting you off the hook. I mean, it's supposed to sound, I think people who say it's supposed to sound gracious, but instead it just makes the thanker sound like they've been an inconvenience, And that is totally antithetical to what courtesy is all about. Courtesy is about making the other person feel more comfortable, always, So, someone says, oh, thank you. You don't say no problem, meaning no problem to me. This could have been a problem, but I'm allowing it not to be a problem. It's the wrong approach, Yeah. So yes, one of my peccadillos. We're going to solve that one.
Solve it. We're going to get rid of it. Yeah. One of there says there's no such thing as a girl's skateboard.
I mean, my daughter taught me that one the first day she saw my son's skateboard and hopped on it, was like crushed him around the park. And I was like, what? Yeah, I don't need my Nerf gun or my Lego set or my skateboard to be painted pink and called a skateboard. That's insulting. That's insulting to me. That's insulting to my daughter. I mean, look, I try to be pretty easygoing about all these gender issues and stuff, which given what I'm about to put out into the world, I'm probably going to have to be. But some of these gender barriers, we are creating them now. Like
they didn't exist like 30, 40 years ago. Like there weren't like girl Legos.
Ago, there was one skateboard, there was Legos. This stuff is new. This is marketing. We've created more gender barriers now than there need to be. I mean, literally, I would not be surprised if there's like a woman's car, or here, check out this female TV. What does that even mean? That is insulting to me. So specifically, there are no girl skateboards. Universally, like she can do anything my son can do. There's just not a boy, girl, this, that, and the other,
Right. No, yeah. I mean, the whole thing has gotten kind of ridiculous, with the men's body wash, right? It's like, it's the same thing. Yeah. It's green and comes in like a black bottle. It's like, it's man. But it even gets more ridiculous, like, in the firearms world, like there's like pink guns.
Guns, yeah.
It's a pink gun. Like what? It's a weapon. Like it's a fire. It doesn't have to be a pink. It doesn't have to be cute. It's a.
You and me, we bear the responsibility for some of this. I'm telling you, 10 years ago when we both had this idea of like, hey, let's kind of like talk about manliness and masculinity and old-fashioned stuff. It wasn't 6 months later that I was actually getting those calls from Dove saying, hey, do you want to blog about men's products? And we created this market niche. I'm not saying you and I created this, but
we're part of it.
We're part of this thing.
Right.
And, we identified a market, and But it's ironic.
It is funny. There's one I liked because the reason I liked it is my wife actually does this rule. It's visit a friend in the hospital, bring bad magazines.
Yes, I always do. My wife always does. I mean, look, we all have our guilty pleasures, right? Our creature comforts, and I think a real friend knows when to let you indulge in those. That's the reality.
That's the reality, yeah.
Now, as I've stated probably like 100 times, I would never, of course, dare to presume that there are any universal truths about the female gender. But they do love bad magazines.
They love trashy magazines, yeah.
They love bad magazines. So do I. But I'm telling you.
I'll admit.
This is like my women be shopping moment. This is like, but they love bad magazines.
Right. Us Weekly, okay. Like, yeah. I've learned that too. Like when my wife was in the hospital, we had to take her to the hospital during her last pregnancy. She had to be there for a few days. And I was like, okay, I know she likes to read bad magazines while she's in the hospital. So I went out and got her some Gatorade and Us Weekly.
And all 6 magazines will have the same 35 long lens paparazzi shots, but they all have just different captions.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. So here's the thing. As a dad who I run a site where I highlight great men from history, and I've got plenty of male role models that I can direct my son towards, right? Like Theodore Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, blah, 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 blah. But I find myself sometimes coming short on women from history, for obvious reasons that could serve as female role models. So I can name a few, but I'm curious, are there women from history that you have in mind in particular for your daughter? They could be from politics, they could be actresses, it could be business women. Like who are some role models that you have in mind for your daughter?
I do. And that's and I include them in the book. I think it's kind of fun to have these pictures of women that I either consider role models, potential role models for my daughter, or who have been role models to me, honestly. And whether that's because they have a particular skill set, whether they are particularly brave, or maybe they're just, so, but the reality is you're right. There are not as many famous women in general. And there's a reason for that. And that's because, basically women have been left out of the history books and they've been left out of the newspapers. A lot of our role models, male role models are, heroes that have achieved these adventures or amazing feats of strength and bravery, and they got put in the newspaper. That's how they became role models and heroes. They were put in the newspaper. I mean, if you think about it, history really is kind of the story of publicity, and women were just not in the spotlight. They weren't allowed to be. So they weren't going to land on the front page. So yeah, we don't have a lot of female role models through history. It's really hard to find them unless you like really like are scholarly and go back and all this stuff. Until you get to kind of this post-suffragette era, you know, in modern media, and then they start to pop up. But there are tons, you know, and it's been fun looking through, not just kind of like contemplating and trying to pick a few that I think are cool, but also realizing like, oh, these are people that have been role models in my life that I maybe didn't even like kind of recognize. You know, so I mean, I'll give you a great example, like Sally Ride, the astronaut, right? So my wife's hero. My wife's an aerospace engineer, wanted to be an astronaut her whole life. She turned me on to who Sally Ride was. And I mean, this is a woman who succeeded in a field of science and engineering that even today is totally male dominated. And then you add like space exploration to it, you know, the right stuff. It's total men's club. And, you know, and she became the first female astronaut. And, you know, that's awesome. She's the kind of role model I want for my daughter. They're athletes like Mia Hamm, who I think is awesome. The old first professional baseball league for women, Annabelle Lefty Lee. I mean, here are people that are, you know, I think they're role models not because they could just play sport, because they could play baseball, but because they did something that people told them that they couldn't do. That's cool. That's punk. You know, that's rock and roll. I think, you know, I don't doubt that a woman can pick up a baseball or a sledgehammer or a discus or a race car or whatever and do anything we can do. But I like the people that pick the stuff that someone says they can't, you know. Another great role model is Margaret Thatcher. You know, forget her politics. I don't care what about her politics. I'm talking about someone who was able to succeed in a male-dominated profession at such a high profile. And, you know, she did this 40 years. 40 years ago, we still haven't had a female head of state, you know, and she's doing it in England. That's impressive. Those are a few. But, you know, I have others that are not just like, it's not always about breaking down gender barriers. You know, there's a lot of women that I really admire purely because of their talents. You know, they're not doing it just like breaking, you know, some barrier but, you know, maybe they're just really witty or really funny. Like Nora Ephron, you know, great writer. Carol Burnett, Elaine Stretch, talked about her, Tina Fey. Or musicians like Big Mama Thornton. You know, she wrote Hound Dog, man. Have you ever heard Big Mama Thornton records? I mean, they're as good as anything you'll ever hear. Blow Elvis and Buddy Holly away, you know, Joni Mitchell. These are women that they're not just women that take on male characteristics, you know, like and doing something that only men used to do, but they're just demonstrating a talent, a passion, commitment, or they just, you know, maybe they just have really good taste. And I like people with good taste.
You know,
so
you like
I've tried it.
Yeah. No, that's great. No, I love this. All right, so like you did in the Rules for My Unborn Son, at the end of the book, you give a list of recommended reading and music suggestions for your daughter. So can you just share a few of those and explain why you picked them?
Yeah, I mean, this is really just my effort to control the stereo in the car for the next
right. And again, like let's remind people, this is like personal taste. Like, sometimes people read this thing and they just like get infuriated because they think like you're like
they think that this is supposed to be some kind of like academic survey of the most important music of the last century, or like this is the most important feminist rock of the last 50 years. That is not it at all. This is like, so my kids like the music that I like, so we can go on road trips and I don't go crazy. This is about totally trying to strong arm my taste onto theirs, and it's my own little personal way to do it. But you know, I did get a chance to pick a bunch of music that I thought not just what my daughter would like, but that were like by women, women that I love, music that I love. You know, because it is cool to see. We have this luxury as men. If you ask a man, make your list of 50 greatest songs, you don't think about if it's a man or a woman. You know, because men are so used to like kind of being the default gender, if you will, which is so ridiculous, but just because of that traditional power structure. You know, I think it's good for a girl to be reminded of like, you can do this, you know, don't let Rolling Stone Top 50 and you see all these men guitarists up there like make you think you can't do this. So like, yeah, it was a chance to make a cool list of female artists. You know, I mean, some of it's the stuff that I listened to as a kid. I mean, my mom playing Bobby Gentry for me, or Dolly Parton. Like I said, Joni Mitchell earlier, but also like there's so many great artists from the 70s. Like I grew up listening to Blondie, Chrissie Hynde from The Pretenders, Joan Jett. That was like the soundtrack to my whole youth, and it wasn't until now when I was putting this list together, I was like, as a kid, I didn't even think about the fact that these were women, but God, that's awesome. There are awesome women in rock. And even in hip hop and R&B, which is, I probably don't listen to it as much, but I did try to put some cool stuff in there, soul and stuff. So it's an awesome mix. You can play it at your next all-women party, or you can just play it at your next party, because it's all good stuff.
Do you have a Spotify list?
No, but I should make one. I'll make one tomorrow.
You should make one. That'd be cool. We can share it. Well, hey, Walker, this has been a great conversation. We got pretty heady in this one for a book that's sort of, was kind of fun, but we got some heady topics, which I liked.
I know. Well, I read what you write all the time, and I know that, it's hard to be the torchbearer for this, this kind of movement, if you will, that too many people might be too quick to judge as being exclusive. But in fact, it is quite the opposite. And I really appreciate some of the times that I've seen you write into your blog post about, this is not about reinvigorating some antiquated, power structure, and I think it's good for you and me to kind of be the ones to stand up and make some of these points. I mean, like I said at the beginning, the best way to make a man into a feminist is to give him a daughter. I want the best for her, and I don't want her to disadvantage, and that's a lot of what writing this book was about.
Awesome. Well, Walker, where can people learn more about your book?
The best way is to just pop it into Google. Rules for My Newborn Daughter.
Newborn daughter. All right.
Because I wrote it after she was born,
okay.
So I had to be fair. And I would go right to Google, which is going to take you to either my website, which is great. You can read some nice blurbs about me and all that kind of stuff. But probably best to just go right to the source and type it into Amazon. Book's going to be available next week. You can pre-order it now. If you pre-order it now, it hits my first week sales, which is awesome. If anybody out there is a self-publisher or wants to know how you jump up on those lists, jack the pre-orders up. That's what I've learned.
Awesome.
Yeah, but that's the best way.
Cool. Walker Lamond, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Brett, I always love talking to you. Keep going with what you're doing. I'm really loving the site. It's great, and thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
All right, talk to you later.
My guest today was Walker Lamond. His latest book is Rules for My Newborn Daughter. You can find it on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can find out more information about Walker's work at walkerlamond.com. Also, make sure to check out the show notes for the show at aom.is/Lamond.